Hi everyone, and welcome to our continuation of Chapter 8. In the last module, we briefly introduced this chapter by talking about the requirements to prove causation. In this week's lecture videos, we're going to explore the different types of experimental designs that can help us on our quest to prove cause and effect relationships, starting with true experiments. True experiments are the gold stars of experimental designs because they contain all possible safety blocks that help us make accurate cause and effect determinations. There are several types of true experimental designs that we'll talk about in this lecture, but all of these designs include three criteria. First, they have an experimental and a control group. The experimental control group is going to receive the independent variable, and the control group will not. This allows the researcher to determine if the cause actually produces the intended effect or if there's another variable playing into the relationship. Second, experimental and control groups must be selected using random assignment. Now, this is a common point of confusion for students. There's actually two places for randomization in experimental design. We can draw the random sample from the population using the probability sampling that we learned previously. The goal of this random selection is to ensure that the sample represents the larger population. But this isn't randomization that I'm talking about here. Random assignment means that once a sample is selected, the sample is split randomly into the experimental and control groups. So they're randomly assigned to either receive the independent variable as the experimental group or to not receive the independent variable if they're the control group. Experimental designs may or may not include random sampling from the population, but they must contain random assignment from the sample into the experimental and control groups. Finally, the third requirement of a true experimental design is that we can manipulate the treatment variable, or the independent variable. Simply put, the independent variable must be something that we can introduce into the situation. This is really important because true experimental designs are going to try to measure the dependent variable both before and after the independent variable occurs. So if the independent variable already exists, for example, like gender or race, then the ability to measure before is going to be hindered. The goal of random assignment is that we want the experimental and control groups to be as similar as possible. By using random assignment, we ensure that those two groups will resemble one another to the best of our abilities. However, in some cases, we can use a non-random assignment process in order to achieve the same equality between control and experimental groups. One such method is called paired matching. This means that every person in the experimental group is matched with a person in the control group using specific characteristics of interest. So if you think pet ownership is important to control in your experiment, and you have a female college student who owns a dog in the experimental group, you want to try to pair her up with another female college student who also owns a dog in the control group. Block matching is more similar to stratified sampling than anything else. First, you take the sample and you separate them into groups based on one or more characteristics that you're interested in studying. Then you use random assignment to split each group into their own experimental and control group and conduct the study accordingly. For example, in the diagram here, the 1,200 subjects are split into male and female groups. Then, within each gender group, random assignment is used to create an experimental group and a control group. The experimental group is given drug X, and the control group is given a placebo. And then the results are compared separately for the male experiment and the female experiment. So now I want to move us into a discussion about the different types of experimental design. These are going to be very important to understand and to be able to identify, as the type of experimental design has multiple implications for the reliability and the validity of the conclusions. To help you understand the specifics of each experimental design, I'm going to use a mapping technique to help you visualize the different components. In this mapping exercise, we'll use the following labels. X stands for the independent variable. O stands for observation of the dependent variable, and R stands for random assignment. Your experimental design maps will also include the labels of pretest, post-test, treatment, experimental group, and control group. The first type of true experimental design that we're going to discuss is the two-group pretest, post-test design, or what is commonly referred to as the ideal experiment. This is a longitudinal design that allows for multiple comparisons. So let's look at what this design looks like. To start an experimental design map, I want you to draw out a 3x4 grid. Along the top, you're going to include these labels: pre-test, treatment, and post-test. Along the side, you're going to include the labels experimental group and control group. The top left box is empty, so I like to put the experimental design name there if you already know it, but you can also just leave this blank. In my case, this is going to be the ideal experiment. Other than the experiment label, you will use this exact chart for every experimental design map that you complete. What we work on is filling out the specific details about the experiment itself. First, we're going to put a capital O under the pretest column for both the experimental and control groups. Remember that O stands for observation of the dependent variable. So in an ideal experiment, we are going to measure the level of the dependent variable before we start the experiment. This measurement is called our pretest. Then we're going to introduce the independent variable, denoted by an X, under the treatment column. Since the control group never gets the treatment by definition, this X will only appear in the experimental group row, no matter what the map. And finally, we're going to put an O in the post-test column for both the experimental groups and the control groups again. So what this design is telling us is that everyone in the sample is tested for the presence and the level of the dependent variable. Then the experimental group gets the treatment, the control group does not. And then everyone in the sample is tested for the presence and the level of the dependent variable again. Now there's one last part of the ideal experiment that we haven't documented on our map yet. Remember that true experiments require random assignment, which we said on the previous slide would be represented by a capital R. We put this R right outside of the map to indicate a random assignment into experimental and control groups. And ta-da, we're done. This is the experimental design map for an ideal experiment. Here's an example of that same experimental design map. This dependent variable is being observed with a paper survey. Everyone in the sample, experimental and control groups, takes the survey. Then the experimental group watches a movie, which is our independent variable, while the control group chills out. Then everyone in the sample takes the survey again. The advantage of the true experimental design is shown with these two blue arrows. Researchers can compare experimental group changes in two ways. First, they can compare post-test values to pre-test values. Has the movie made a difference? Second, they can compare post-test values of the experimental group to the post-test values of the control group. This is an important way to identify spurious relationships. Maybe there's something else going on that's affecting the survey responses. If so, the control group is going to show a change in the dependent variable as well, even though they didn't receive the treatment. So this will tell our researcher that they need to look out for something else that's having an effect on the responses. The second type of true experimental design discussed in your textbook is the two-group post-test only. And this is exactly what it sounds like. It has both an experimental and a control group, hence the two groups, but it doesn't include a pretest. In terms of an experimental map, we start with the same basic layout. We add in our 3x4 group and we put all the labels up that we did before, this time changing the name to two-group post-test instead of ideal experiment. Now this time we're going to leave the pretest column blank because there's no pretest. Instead, we start with the X for the treatment and then we add a post-test to both groups. And once again, we're going to use random assignment so we can include an R to the left of our map. As you can see, the major limitation of the two-group post-test only design is that without a pretest, we can't compare pretest to post-test values. We must use the control group instead to make assumptions about what those values would be because we didn't introduce the independent variable to that group, and so we don't expect a change in response. However, the two-group post-test only can be a very helpful way to measure a relationship when there are concerns about a pretest impacting the post-test values. I'll explain that further in our last lecture video when we talk about validity concerns with experimental designs. The last type of experimental group that I want to show you is called the Solomon 4-group design. It's a little out of our depth in this course, so I don't expect you to actually apply this at any time, but I do want you to be familiar with what this design is. The Solomon four-group design is a combination of the ideal experiment and the two-group post-test only design. Instead of being randomly assigned to an experimental or a control group only, this sample is randomly assigned to one of four groups. Two of the groups are going to receive the treatment, but only one of those experimental groups will actually receive a pretest. Similarly, there are two possible control group assignments, neither of which are going to receive the treatment, and one of which will receive the pretest. Because of the duplication of experimental and control groups, the Solomon four-group design allows for several more comparison options that are not achievable within the ideal or the two-group design only. All right, well, that concludes our discussion about true experimental designs. Join me in the next lecture as I map out the experimental designs that don't meet the requirement to be called a true experiment.